What happens when a 70-year-old retired detective stumbles upon a mystery that makes his 30-year career look like child's play? I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about retirement, small towns, and the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. My name is Frank Morrison, and for 3 decades I wore the badge in Detroit. I've seen things that would make your blood run cold, solved cases that kept me awake for months, and put away criminals who belonged in nightmares. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened to me 6 months into my retirement in the quiet town of Millbrook, Michigan. You see, when you spend 30 years as a detective, retirement isn't just a career change. It's like someone suddenly turns off a radio that's been blasting in your head for decades. The silence is deafening. The routine investigations, the adrenaline rushes, the constant mental chess games with criminals, all of it just stops. And you're left sitting in a rocking chair on your porch, wondering if this is how your story ends. I moved to Millbrook because it was everything Detroit wasn't. Population 3,847, one main street, a place where the biggest crime was usually teenagers toilet papering the school principal's house. My wife Sarah had passed 2 years before my retirement, and I thought small-town life would help me find some peace. Boy, was I wrong. The incident I'm about to tell you about started on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember it clearly because it was exactly 6:47 a.m. when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door. Now, Mrs. Henderson was my 78-year-old neighbor, a sweet lady who brought me casseroles twice a week and always asked about my garden. But that morning she looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Frank," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something terribly wrong at the old Blackwood house." The Blackwood house. Every town has one of those houses, doesn't it? The one that sits at the end of a dead-end street, windows boarded up, lawn overgrown, carrying decades of whispered stories and urban legends. The Blackwood house had been empty for 15 years, ever since old Thomas Blackwood disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a property that no one wanted to touch. Mrs. Henderson explained that she'd been walking her dog early that morning when she noticed something odd. The front door of the Blackwood house was wide open, and there were fresh tire tracks in the driveway. But here's the thing that made my detective instincts kick in immediately, even in retirement. There were no cars in sight, and the tire tracks looked fresh, like they'd been made just hours before. Now, any reasonable person would have called the local police. But remember, I'm a retired detective with 30 years of experience, and frankly, I was bored out of my mind. The thought of a real mystery, something to sink my teeth into, was more appealing than another day of crossword puzzles and daytime television. I told Mrs. Henderson I'd look into it, grabbed my old service weapon that I still kept locked in my safe, and headed over to the Blackwood house. As I approached the property, every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades started firing. The grass wasn't just overgrown, it was trampled in specific patterns, like someone had been walking back and forth regularly. The windows weren't just boarded up. Some of the boards looked newer than others, like they'd been recently replaced. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. You know how abandoned places usually sound? There's always something. Wind through broken windows, creaking wood, settling foundations. The Blackwood house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. I approached the open front door cautiously. The hinges didn't creak, which meant they'd been recently oiled. Inside, my flashlight beam revealed something that made my blood run cold. The house wasn't abandoned. It was being lived in. There was modern furniture covered with dust sheets, like someone had been preparing to move in or had recently moved out. There were fresh groceries on the kitchen counter, some still in bags. The refrigerator was running, humming softly in the kitchen. But here's the detail that made my skin crawl. There were at least 6 different sets of keys hanging on hooks by the door, each labeled with names I didn't recognize. As I moved through the house, I noticed something that would have been invisible to most people, but after 30 years of crime scenes, I could read it like a book. There were signs of multiple people living here, but not like a family. The bathroom had different brands of toiletries, like each person had their own supplies. The bedroom had multiple sleeping bags arranged in a precise pattern on the floor. Then I found the basement. The basement door was locked, but it was a cheap lock, the kind that's more for privacy than security. I picked it easily, another skill from my detective days that came in handy. What I found down there changed everything. The basement had been converted into what looked like a command center. There were multiple computers, filing cabinets, and most disturbing of all, a wall covered with photographs and documents. But these weren't random photos. They were surveillance photos of people in town, people I recognized. Mrs. Henderson was there, the local bank manager, the school principal, even me. My photo was recent, taken through my kitchen window, showing me making coffee just days before. Someone had been watching me, watching all of us, and using the abandoned Blackwood house as their base of operations. But the real shock came when I found the files. Detailed files on dozens of Millbrook residents, complete with daily routines, financial information, family details, and something called viability assessments. These people weren't just watching us, they were evaluating us for something. I was so focused on the files that I almost missed the sound of footsteps upstairs. Someone had come back, multiple someones, based on the different footfall patterns. I was trapped in a basement with one exit, and whoever was upstairs clearly wasn't supposed to know I was there. This is where 30 years of experience kicks in. Instead of panicking, I switched off my flashlight and listened. There were at least 3 people upstairs, maybe 4. They were talking in hushed voices, but sound carries in old houses, and I could make out fragments of conversation. "The timeline has moved up," said one voice. "Are we sure about the selections?" asked another. "The old detective could be a problem," said a third voice, and I felt my blood turn to ice. They knew who I was. They knew I was a threat to whatever they were planning. But they didn't know I was currently standing in their basement, listening to every word. I spent the next hour crouched in that basement, listening to fragments of conversation that painted a picture so disturbing, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. These people weren't just watching the town. They were planning something called the collection. And from what I could gather, it involved taking people from Millbrook, people who met certain criteria, people who wouldn't be missed immediately, the elderly who lived alone, the unemployed who had no family nearby, the transients who drifted through town. They were building a list, and they were almost ready to act. When the voices finally moved away from the basement area, I made my move. I quickly photographed as many documents as I could with my phone, memorized the layout of their setup, and most importantly, I took one of the flash drives from their computer setup. Then I made my way back upstairs and out of the house as quietly as I could. But as I was leaving, I made a mistake that almost cost me everything. I was so focused on getting out unseen that I forgot about the motion sensor light on the neighbor's property. The moment I stepped into their yard, it blazed on, lighting me up like a Christmas tree. I heard shouts from inside the Blackwood house, and I knew I had seconds before they came after me. I'm 70 years old, but terror has a way of making you forget your age. I ran harder than I had in 20 years, cutting through yards and alleys, using every trick I'd learned in 3 decades of chasing and being chased. I made it home, but I knew they'd seen me. I knew they knew that I knew, and I knew that everything was about to change. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat in my kitchen with my service weapon on the table, going through the files I'd photographed and the data on the flash drive. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't just a local operation. The files referenced similar collections in other small towns across the Midwest. They were part of something bigger, something organized, something that had been going on for years. And Millbrook was next. The flash drive contained detailed plans for something called Phase 3, which involved the systematic disappearance of 23 specific individuals from our town over the course of 6 months. The plan was sophisticated, designed to make the disappearances look like people who had simply moved away or met with accidents. But the most chilling part was the efficiency of it all. They had contingency plans for everything, including what to do if they were discovered. And according to their files, I was now classified as a Level 1 threat who needed to be neutralized immediately. I had two choices, run or fight. At 70, running seemed like the smart choice. But I looked at those files, at the photos of my neighbors, at the detailed plans for their disappearances, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I ran away and let this happen. So I did what any good detective would do. I called in backup. But not the local police. They were a two-man operation who handled parking tickets and noise complaints. I called my old partner Tony in Detroit, who was still active duty and had connections with federal agencies. Within 6 hours, I had FBI agents in my kitchen, going through every piece of evidence I'd collected. Within 12 hours, they had surveillance teams positioned around the Blackwood house. Within 24 hours, they had arrested 5 people and discovered a trafficking operation that spanned 7 states. But here's the thing about being a retired detective who stumbles into something this big. It doesn't end when the arrests are made. The investigation revealed that I had uncovered the advance team for a human trafficking ring that had been operating in small Midwest towns for over a decade. They would send scouts to identify targets, set up temporary operations, and then systematically make people disappear. The people they targeted weren't random. They were specifically chosen because they were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be missed immediately. The elderly, the unemployed, the transients, people like me who had recently moved to town and didn't have strong social connections yet. The trial lasted 8 months. I testified 6 times, each time reliving that night in the basement, each time remembering the cold calculation in those files. 5 people were convicted on federal trafficking charges, and the investigation they triggered led to the discovery of 3 more cells in other states. But the real impact wasn't the convictions or the media attention. It was what happened to Millbrook. Our quiet little town became the center of a national news story. Property values plummeted. People started locking their doors for the first time in decades. The sense of safety and community that had drawn me to Millbrook in the first place was shattered. And yet, something else emerged from the wreckage. The investigation brought people together in ways I hadn't expected. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other started checking on one another. Community watch programs were established. Mrs. Henderson started a weekly coffee group for elderly residents to make sure no one was isolated. As for me, retirement took on a whole new meaning. I realized that being a detective wasn't just a job I'd left behind. It was part of who I am. The instincts, the training, the need to protect people, none of that disappears when you turn in your badge. I now volunteer with the FBI's Citizens Academy, teaching people how to recognize signs of trafficking and organized crime. I consult with small police departments on cases that are beyond their usual scope. And I've learned that retirement doesn't mean the end of your story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a new chapter. The Blackwood house was eventually demolished. The city bought the property and turned it into a small park with a memorial to trafficking victims. But sometimes, when I walk past that space, I remember that night in the basement, listening to voices planning to destroy lives. And I'm reminded that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like an abandoned house in a quiet town. Sometimes it hides behind boarded windows and overgrown lawns. And sometimes it takes a 70-year-old retired detective with insomnia and too much time on his hands to shine a light into the darkness. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that age is just a number when it comes to making a difference. Whether you're 30 or 70, whether you're active duty or retired, whether you're a professional or just a concerned citizen, you have the power to change things. So the next time you see something that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Ask questions. Pay attention, because you never know when your curiosity might save someone's life. And if you're thinking about retirement, remember this. The skills and instincts that made you good at your job don't disappear when you clock out for the last time. They just find new ways to serve the world.